My house survived the doom, and 1,000 tribulations besides. And gods be damned. I will not see it ended on the account of this. Say it.
So we all remember episode 8 of House of the Dragon. After an injury at sea leaves Corlys incapacitated and his survival uncertain, there is a meeting held to decide exactly who will sit the Driftwood throne as the Lord of the Tides upon his possible death. During this position, two claims are considered. The legal but not blood son of former Prince Consort Vaemond Velaryon, Viserys Velaryon, who is truly the son of Sir Harwin Strong, and his supposed relative, the brother of his legal grandfather Corlys Velaryon, Vaemond Velaryon. Despite being a second son and not a direct descendant of Corlys Velaryon, Vaemond arguably has the strongest claim to driftmark. Even though Viserys is known publicly and legally as the son of the believed to be late Laenor Velaryon, it's an open secret about who his father really is. Despite bearing the name, Luke is not of Velaryon blood. Even if we were to take into account the Velaryon women that married into the Targaryen family years ago, it's not enough to really give Luke a reasonable claim to the Driftwood throne outside of his supposed parentage, whereas Vaemond has no issues in that regard. He has both the name and blood to match it. As he says himself,
I am the sea snake's own blood, the closest kin he has left.
He is the closest kin his brother has left. This, of course, excludes Baela and Rhaena. Even though they are his only true grandchildren, Baela and Rhaena are Targaryen by name, and the way Driftmark operates isn't like the Iron Throne. They still prefer men ruling to women. Even though it seems implied by Rhaenys in episode 7 that Corlys could change that, it's unlikely, but I digress. Despite having a solid claim to the Driftwood throne, being a true-born Velaryon with no rumors surrounding his parentage, being the brother of the Sea Snake himself, and being reasonably experienced in combat and naval warfare, Vaemond is passed over in favor of a bastard boy greener than summer grass, because Rhaenyra has one thing on her side that no one else does: a father who's willing to defy death just to see her succeed. Though one could argue him trying so hard for Rhaenyra is one of the main reasons she's in such a compromising position in the first place. But that's not the topic for today's video. After being scorned in favor of an illegitimate child with no real connection to his family, Vaemond knows that he'll see no justice for his lineage. He's fed up, having to play second fiddle to Corlys, whose decisions and delusions of grandeur keep putting their family at risk.
The matter has been decided.
By a man whose ambition has brought down on us calamity after calamity. My brother cares only for the history books.
And now he's expected to kneel to a bastard, call him Lord of the Tides, and leave his family legacy in his hands. It's unacceptable, especially since there's a heavy prejudice against bastard children in Westeros. They're seen as evil personified, so the idea of one leading his family is like an insult, a stain on their Valyrian legacy. And Velaryon blood must always run true. He says as much during Laena's funeral, essentially calling out Rhaenyra's children, and then does the same when he's robbed of driftmark.
That is no true Velaryon, and certainly no nephew of mine.
Knowing he won't get what he feels he rightfully deserves, Vaemond decides to fall on his sword and speak a truth that no one else will. This, of course, ends in his demise, removing him as a potential piece on the board known as the Dance of the Dragons. But what if this didn't happen? What if Vaemond got to keep much more than his tongue during that fateful day? What if Vaemond got exactly what he felt was owed? What if Vaemond won? We'll set the stage in episode 8. The lords have gathered for the petition of driftmark. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the king's firstborn child and heir to the throne, is here to stand for her son, Viserys Velaryon, and Vaemond is here to stand for himself. Not only does he have a legitimate claim to driftmark, the Sea Snake's brother has already gotten in bed with the Greens, so he's supremely confident in the way things will turn out for him. Rhaenyra, on the other hand, is very nervous. Despite claiming her sons as legitimate heirs to Laenor Velaryon, she, and so do most other people, know that this is not true. And with her father bedridden and the Greens in control, it's unlikely that she'll come out on top. In canon, Vaemond gives his speech, and Rhaenyra takes a few jabs at him, calling him ambitious and selfish, trying to discredit him in any way she can so he won't discredit her sons. Unfortunately for her, Vaemond is unbothered. He gives as good as he gets, and mounts a reasonable case for driftmark. Then when it's Rhaenyra's turn to speak for Viserys, before she can truly mount her argument, her father Viserys rises from the grave to defend his daughter. And this is where we make our first, most important change. As long as Viserys arrives just in time, Rhaenyra will always win, as her father will throw the weight of his crown behind his daughter every time. So to give Vaemond a chance at actually winning, you need to get rid of Viserys entirely. And that's not too hard to do. In episode 8, Viserys is literally just skin and bones, being held together by what I can only assume is necromancy at this point. He's usually in great pain, and most of the time he isn't even aware of what's going on around him, especially when he's on Milk of the Poppy. This, I believe, is one of the main reasons he was able to get up and support Rhaenyra. After Vaemond's death, he says,
I will not close my mind. I must put things right.
Which implies that he stopped drinking the Milk of the Poppy for this occasion. This enabled him to power through the pain briefly so he could support Rhaenyra. But this time around, we'll say this doesn't happen. Instead of taking the red pill, which keeps his eyes open and enables him to persevere, he takes the blue pill, which grants him relief but clouds his mind. The day of Driftmark's petition, the king is in a lot of pain, more so than usual. Instead of enduring for Rhaenyra, he drinks his Milk of the Poppy for relief. It calms, but also incapacitates him. So this time, the king isn't going to show up for his daughter. Rhaenyra has to stand alone in this nest of vipers. So she gives the speech that she wasn't able to in canon. She reminds everyone of her marriage to Laenor, and that these were his true-born sons and heirs, recognized by Corlys Velaryon himself. She takes a few more jabs at Vaemond, calling him greedy, trying to use his status as a second son against him as reasoning for him trying to usurp her sons. Vaemond laughs this off, of course. Rhaenyra wishes her father were here. He would stand for her, but Viserys never arrives. And when all is said and done, Otto names Vaemond as heir to Driftmark and future Lord of the Tides. The Hightowers land their first devastating blow. Vaemond being named heir over Viserys is dangerous. With the narrative that Viserys is actually the true-born son of Laenor Velaryon, then by all means he should have inherited Driftmark with no issue. But that doesn't happen. So with Vaemond being chosen, it calls the validity of Luke's claim to Driftmark into question. And by calling Luke's inheritance into question, it also calls Jace's into question, along with that of Joffrey. Because, as I mentioned before, if they really were true-born, then why were the direct male descendants of the Sea Snake passed over for an uncle? So, Vaemond's victory puts more scrutiny on Rhaenyra and her sons, so she's in a much more stressful place than she was in the canon timeline. And not just stressful either, she'll also be more vulnerable. Because with Vaemond's victory, Rhaenys will not betroth her granddaughters Baela and Rhaena to Jace and Luke. Rhaenys is on rocky terms with Rhaenyra after Laenor, and in canon, she didn't agree to a marriage pact out of the kindness of her heart. Since the beginning of the story, Rhaenys has wanted her children far from the royal family. She didn't want Laena, her then 12-year-old daughter, to marry King Viserys, and then she didn't want Laenor to marry Rhaenyra. She knew there was danger around her. Even if the Lords of the Realm swore to her years ago, as a woman, her reign would always be challenged. And with the birth of Aegon, it was almost certain. She knew her family would be in danger because sooner or later, there would be conflict, and she was proven right as time passed, with both of her children dying, and tensions between the Blacks and Greens steadily rising. The petition for Driftmark was no different. She knew the danger of supporting Rhaenyra, because if she aligned herself with her, and she was taken out, chances are she and the rest of her family would be too.
You can bargain with me all you like. Bring my granddaughter with you to soften my resolve. But tomorrow the Hightowers land their first blow. They force you to your knees, and I must stand alone.
The only reason she agrees in canon is because of Viserys. By throwing his weight behind her and declaring for Viserys, it appears she has a fighting chance. So, Rhaenys decides to take one herself. But this is different. Viserys isn't here to support Rhaenyra and let his favor be known. So Rhaenys is less willing to step out on a limb for her. She won't risk her granddaughters after a loss like this. So Rhaenyra and her family stand alone, while Vaemond gets the right to inherit Driftmark upon his brother's death. And before someone says it in the comments, no, I don't see Daemon killing Vaemond after the ruling so Viserys can still inherit Driftmark. In canon, Vaemond's death was excusable. He openly insulted his stepsons and then insulted his wife's honor by calling her
a whore.
So Daemon's killing could be ruled as him defending his family against slander. Vaemond openly defied the king's decision and insulted the heirs of the realm, which, as Rhaenyra stated in episode 7,
"This is the highest of treasons."
Here though, this was a legal hearing, held by a man bearing the authority of the king. If Daemon lashed out without reason, prince or no, it would not be a good look. So Vaemond gets to keep his life, not just his tongue this time around. And this means that Rhaenys has no reason to stay in King's Landing. In canon, the reason she stayed behind and got captured by the Greens is because the Silent Sisters were still preparing Vaemond's body to be sent back to Driftmark so it could be buried. Here though, she doesn't have to wait on anything since Vaemond is perfectly capable of moving himself around. So she'll just leave with Baela. So this means when episode 9 rolls around, there will be no Meleys bursting out of the dragon pit and committing mass murder. Moving on though, this is a crushing blow for the Blacks to say the least, and it has Rhaenyra down. But I would say Daemon, or one of her sons, most likely Jace, reminds her of one very important fact. Vaemond is only the heir to Driftmark, not the Lord of Driftmark. That title still belongs to Corlys Velaryon, meaning he has the last say when it comes to House Velaryon and who they support. This whole petition only came about because people were uncertain that he would live, but we know that he will. So while the Blacks may have lost the petition, they haven't lost the Velaryons. Yet. They have to hope that Corlys somehow pulls through. If he lives, then perhaps they can get him to reaffirm Lucerys as his heir to King Viserys, maybe getting him to change the succession back to what it was before. But we all know Viserys might not be around long enough for that to happen. Fast forwarding to the dinner scene, there are a few things different. For starters, things are rather tense when it comes to the families, more so than in the original. The Greens took Luke's inheritance and called the legitimacy of Rhaenyra's sons into question all in one move. So naturally, Rhaenyra and Daemon are not happy about that. Also, there are less people here. Baela is not here since she left with Rhaenys. Baela was a ward of Driftmark, if I'm not mistaken, and she had no reason to stay around because 1, Rhaenys wasn't spending the night waiting for Vaemond's body, and 2, she was never betrothed to Jace in this timeline. Nor was Rhaena to Lucerys. But she's still here though because she was a ward on Dragonstone, I'm pretty sure. Regardless, Baela is not here, and as I mentioned before, she and her sister were not engaged to the Strong Boys. So this time around, we don't get that toast of victory for Team Black like we did in canon, since Lucerys not only lost Driftmark, but didn't get engaged. Instead, the Greens toast to Sir Vaemond, which irks Team Black, but they can do nothing about it for the time being. The king still attends this dinner, but unlike in canon, he's a bit out of it. As I mentioned before in this video, this is a King Viserys with a more clouded mind. He refused to put down the bottle and has become more reliant on Milk of the Poppy. As a result, he isn't as alert. He's making mistakes and doesn't really know what's happening around him. He tries to give the same speech he did in canon, but he's struggling more than he did before. He makes mistakes, forgets what he's saying mid-sentence, and looks more like a bumbling old man. So this time, his speech fails to have the same impact it did before. And as a result of this speech lacking impact, we don't get that same scene of Rhaenyra and Alicent toasting to one another, trying to make amends. He didn't inspire that emotion in them this time around. Moving on though, things go somewhat similarly to canon after that. The Blacks all leave, the king dies, and Aegon is crowned king the next day. Some notable differences is that for one, Rhaenys is not here, as I mentioned earlier, so Alicent never tries and fails to convince her to defect from Rhaenyra. She also doesn't interrupt Aegon's coronation with Meleys bursting out of the dragon pit, so instead of that, we get to see Aegon do a victory lap around the city with Sunfire like he did in the books. Also, because Rhaenys is not here, the Blacks don't find out that Viserys died and Aegon has been crowned until Eric Cargyle comes around. This means they'll be oblivious for a few days about what's happening in King's Landing. Rhaenys says herself that she was trapped for a day or two while the Queen made plans. This gives the Greens a period of uninterrupted time to make whatever plans that they want. It's only when Eric Cargyle defects that they will find out what happened. This information causes Rhaenyra to go into labor much later than she did before, and perhaps the Greens will show up with their terms just as Rhaenyra is about to bury her daughter. Like in canon, they offer to let her keep Dragonstone as her primary seat to pass on to Jace. Rhaenyra responds that they forgot about Driftmark. It is her second son's seat by right. Otto says that the matter of Driftmark's succession was already settled. Vaemond is its heir, to which Rhaenyra responds that he is no more heir than Aegon is king, similar to what she said to Otto in the canon timeline.
You are no more hand than Aegon is king.
Fucking traitor.
So this sets up some conflict down the line. Now here, with Rhaenyra still being crowned queen and in defiance of the Greens, the big question is, with Vaemond's victory, do the Velaryons still support the Blacks? There are a couple options here. The first is no, they don't. With Rhaenyra losing to Vaemond in King's Landing, Rhaenys is more hesitant to stick her neck out for her. She's always been against getting involved with the royal family, and Rhaenyra's position as heir has always been shaky. So are that of her sons, and with their first loss to the Greens, it would really put things into perspective just how stacked the odds were against her. Especially since Vaemond is still alive, chances are that he'd declare for the Greens since they gave him power if they went to war. That could lead to infighting within House Velaryon if they were to side with the Blacks. And Rhaenys doesn't want that. Corlys wouldn't either. In the canon timeline, Corlys was fed up at this point. He no longer wanted to pursue greatness, nor did he want to support Rhaenyra. By supporting her, he compromised his family, lost his only son, and chances are if he stood with her, his house would be ruined forever. So he wanted to declare for no one.
We shall declare for no one. We will retire to high tide to be content with our grandchildren.
And this would be easy for them to do now, since Baela and Rhaena are not married to Jace and Luke. They have no obligation to the Blacks, so they could honestly just leave them out to dry. This would be really bad for Rhaenyra since she'd lose her biggest ally, their wealth and naval power. It would not look good. But let's say the Velaryons do choose to side with her regardless. Like in canon, Rhaenys convinces Corlys to side with Rhaenyra. Though she didn't seem to care for the strong boys before, she seems to have come around. She knows that if they abandon Rhaenyra, chances are that she and her sons will be killed by the Greens. So out of the goodness of her heart, she convinces Corlys to help them. This presents another problem. Vaemond. Vaemond was named heir to Driftmark by the Greens. It's safe to assume that if push comes to shove, he'd support them. And if Corlys declares for Rhaenyra, this once again brings into question, who is the rightful heir to Driftmark? Rhaenyra has already let it be known that she doesn't acknowledge Vaemond as heir. She's queen, and the Greens are traitors in her eyes. Why should she consider their decision? So what I believe we could potentially see if Corlys sides with Rhaenyra, and by default Viserys, is a split in House Velaryon, much like the one we see in House Targaryen. One side who wants to follow Corlys, their lord, declaring for Viserys and by default the Blacks, and the other side who would declare for Vaemond, viewing him as the rightful heir to Driftmark, not recognizing Viserys as heir and by default siding with the Greens. It's plausible since in the books, Vaemond wasn't the only Velaryon who didn't think Luke should inherit Driftmark. Vaemond's sons and cousins believed they all had stronger claims to Driftmark. And after he died, while the sons eventually made up with Team Black, Vaemond's cousins sided with the Greens after his death. So now, with Vaemond being named heir by the Greens, maybe more Velaryons will end up taking his side. And the dance won't just be between dragons. It'll be for the seas, too. So, with Vaemond being named heir, either way you look at it, Rhaenyra is going to be worse off than she was in canon, with her kids being under more scrutiny and her biggest supporter either being divided or absent altogether. A Vaemond victory may just be a loss for Team Black. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, tell me what you thought in the comments, and I will see you all next time.